In 1286, in Italy, someone solved failing eyesight by grinding two lenses into rings of bone. A friar met the man, spoke with him, then never wrote down his name. Centuries later, historians exposed the hero credited for that invention ever since as a total fraud. In this video, 10 medieval inventions that reshaped the world, and the final one broke a 1,000-year monopoly on knowledge. Let's go. Number 10. Eyeglasses. Somewhere in Pisa, sometime around 1286, a craftsman ground two pieces of curved glass, set them into rings of bone or metal, hinged them together, and gave the world one of its most used inventions in history. Then he disappeared from the record completely, and nobody has ever found him again. The only reason we know a date at all comes from a sermon. On the 23rd of February, 1306, a Dominican friar named Giordano da Pisa stood up in a church in Florence and told his congregation something remarkable. The art of making eyeglasses, he said, was not even 20 years old. He said it almost as an aside, a passing marvel, the way someone today might mention a new piece of software. He did not know he was leaving behind the only written trace of one of the great inventions of the medieval world. Here is the detail that makes this stranger than a simple case of a lost name. Giordano was not repeating rumor. He said, in the same sermon, that he had personally met the man who invented eyeglasses, spoken with him directly, and been told the story himself. And then, for reasons no historian has ever been able to explain, he never wrote the name down. A friar stood face to face with the inventor of a tool that would eventually sit on the faces of billions of people, and he let the moment pass without a single word of identification. Giordano did have a friend, another friar named Alessandro della Spina, who apparently learned the secret method either from Giordano or from the same circle of craftsmen. Della Spina became the first person on record to make eyeglasses publicly and share the technique openly, rather than guarding it as a trade secret. A chronicle from his monastery, written after his death in 1313, credits him with reproducing something he had only seen once, refusing to keep it to himself. That single act of open-handedness may be the reason eyeglasses spread across Europe at all, instead of dying with one workshop in one city. For centuries afterward, Italian tradition tried to fill in the blank the sermon left behind. A name began circulating: Salvino degli Armati, a Florentine nobleman, supposedly buried under a stone slab, crediting him as the inventor of eyeglasses. Visitors were shown his tomb. Encyclopedias repeated the claim for hundreds of years. Then genealogists actually checked the Armati family records, and the story fell apart in their hands. No Salvino Armati appears anywhere in the family's documented history from that period. The tomb, the name, the whole tidy origin story, was a fabrication invented long after the fact, built to give a nameless miracle a face and a family crest. So the honest answer, the one historians actually stand behind today, is the least satisfying one possible. Someone in Pisa in the 1280s solved a problem that had troubled scholars, monks, and merchants for as long as anyone could read. The eyes fail years before the mind does. That person handed the solution to a friar, and the friar let his name slip through his fingers. We know almost nothing about who deserves the credit. We know everything about what the invention did once it escaped its workshop. Those very first lenses were convex, ground to help with the one problem every aging reader eventually shares: the slow blurring of anything held close to the face. They could do nothing yet for someone who struggled to see clearly at a distance. That second kind of correction, a concave lens shaped the opposite way, would not reliably appear for roughly another century and a half, worked out gradually by lens grinders whose names have survived scarcely better than the first anonymous craftsman in Pisa. What that first pair of curved lenses did, though, was enough on its own to matter. A monk copying scripture, a merchant checking a ledger, a judge reading a contract, All of them had a hard ceiling on their working years the moment their eyesight began to fail, usually somewhere in their 40s. Eyeglasses did not just correct vision. They quietly added a decade or more of skilled, literate working life to exactly the people medieval society depended on most to read, write, and keep records. At the precise moment, their eyes would otherwise have forced them into retirement. An anonymous craftsman gave the medieval world clearer eyes. The next invention on this list gave it something closer to nightmares. A pope who tried and failed to outlaw a weapon by name. Number 9. The crossbow. In 1139, inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome, the Second Lateran Council opened with the usual business of medieval church law, clerical marriage, simony, the discipline of bishops. Then, almost as an afterthought, the assembled clergy passed a canon aimed at a piece of wood and sinew. They banned the crossbow. Not against everyone, though. The council, under Pope Innocent II, declared the weapon deadly and hateful to God, unfit for use between Christians, and permitted it only against enemies of the faith. A council of the church had just tried to legislate mercy onto a battlefield by banning one specific weapon by name, the only time in the era that anything like it happened. It did not work. Within a lifetime, crossbows were standard equipment in armies across Christian Europe, wielded by Christians against other Christians on a routine basis, canon law or no canon law. The ban is remembered today less as an act of restraint and more as the moment the medieval church admitted in writing that this particular weapon terrified it more than swords, spears, or axes ever had. The reason for that fear was simple mechanics. A longbow took years, sometimes a lifetime of daily practice to use effectively at range, building the specific muscle and technique needed to draw a heavy bow accurately under pressure. A crossbow needed almost none of that. Load the bolt, aim down a simple stock, pull a trigger. A farmer with a few weeks of instruction could kill an armored knight who had trained since childhood at a distance, without ever crossing swords with him. That is the detail that explains the panic in Rome. The crossbow did not just kill efficiently. It broke a monopoly. For centuries, the ability to kill in battle had belonged mostly to men who could afford years of training and the equipment that came with it, largely the nobility. A cheap mechanical trigger handed that same lethal power to almost anyone who could be taught to point and pull. Engineers kept improving the weapon anyway, church objections or not. Sometime across the 12th and 13th centuries, someone added a windlass, a small hand-cranked winch mounted on the stock, letting a single soldier draw a bowstring far heavier than human arm strength alone could ever manage. Draw weights climbed. Range and penetrating power climbed with them. By the 1200s, entire military careers were built around the weapon. Mercenaries from the city of Genoa in northern Italy became the most sought-after crossbow specialists on the continent, hired by kings and city-states across Europe who could afford their contracts. A Genoese crossbowman was, in effect, a professional soldier for hire, trained and equipped by his home city, then rented out under contract to whichever ruler could pay for the season. It was a new kind of military career entirely, built around a machine rather than a bloodline, open to any man from a maritime republic willing to learn the trade rather than inherit a title. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, thousands of Genoese crossbowmen fought in French service against the English, in one of the most famous and most disastrous deployments of the weapon in medieval history, undone that day less by the crossbow's own limits than by rain-soaked bowstrings, and a battlefield they never should have been ordered onto. Here is the deeper unease under the papal ban, the part that outlasted the weapon itself. The council in 1139 was not really worried about death. Medieval Europe was no stranger to death in battle. It was worried about who got to deliver it. For as long as anyone could remember, the right to kill with a bow or a blade on a battlefield had been, in practice, a privilege of birth and training, wrapped in the language of chivalry and honor. The crossbow did not care about birth or years of training. It cared about a trigger, a weapon that let an untrained peasant end the life of a mounted, armored, aristocratic knight from 30 paces away. Was not just a battlefield problem. It was a social one, and everyone who held power in 1139 understood exactly what that meant, even if the council's official language never said it in those terms. Notice, too, the specific exception the council carved out. Christians were not to use the crossbow against other Christians, but the ban explicitly permitted it against enemies of the faith. Within a generation, crusading armies were doing exactly that, arming Christian soldiers with the very weapon the church had just called hateful to God, so long as the arrows flew toward a non-Christian target. A rule written to protect Christian lives quietly became a rule about which lives counted, and which did not, and almost nobody in power seemed troubled by the contradiction. The ban was quietly abandoned within a generation, even inside Christian armies. The weapon was not. It stayed in continuous military use for another 300 years, only fading once gunpowder weapons finally matched its ease of use with even greater range and force. Rome tried to put a weapon back in its box with a papal decree. The next entry on this list needed no ban, no council, no argument at all. It simply pointed everyone who used it toward the open sea, and let the ocean do the rest. Number 8. The magnetic compass. Sometime between 1187 and 1202, an English scholar named Alexander Neckham sat down to write a practical handbook of everyday objects and tools, something closer to a medieval how-to manual than a work of philosophy. Buried inside a chapter about ships and sailing gear, in a book called the Utensilibus, he casually mentioned something no earlier European writer had ever put into words. Sailors, he wrote, used a needle that pointed north, mounted so it could turn freely, to find their way when the sky gave them nothing to steer by. It is the first known description of a magnetic compass anywhere in European literature, tucked almost as an afterthought into a passage about crossing the English Channel. Before that needle, sailing out of sight of land was, quite literally, a gamble taken against the sky. Mariners steered by the sun during the day and by the stars at night, a method that had worked badly for thousands of years. It failed completely under cloud cover, and it failed completely by daylight without landmarks. A single stretch of overcast weather could leave a ship's crew with no reliable way to know which direction they were even facing, adrift not just on water but in their own sense of the world. Coastal hugging was not a preference. It was survival. Ships crawled along shorelines they could see, adding days and weeks to every voyage, because losing sight of land usually meant losing any idea of where you were. The compass itself was not a European idea. Chinese scholars had already been experimenting with magnetized needles and their directional properties by the 12th century, in the context of divination long before anyone thought to mount one on a boat. Exactly how the concept crossed from Chinese workshops to European ships remains genuinely unclear, lost somewhere in centuries of trade contact across the Silk Road and Mediterranean shipping lanes that left no single paper trail behind it. What is clear is that Neckham's brief mention in England marks the moment the idea surfaces in the West with unmistakable clarity, already in practical use among working sailors, rather than presented as some exotic curiosity from a distant land. Once it arrived, it spread fast, because the problem it solved was universal to anyone who had ever tried to cross open water. By the 1300s, the compass was standard equipment from the Mediterranean to the Baltic and out to the edges of the known Islamic trading world, carried on merchant cogs and naval galleys alike. A simple needle, floated on a splinter of wood or mounted on a dry pivot, gave every sailor who carried one a fixed, reliable answer to the single most dangerous question at sea. Which way is north? Right now, regardless of weather, regardless of the hour, regardless of how far the coastline had slipped below the horizon. Sailors did not trust the new instrument blindly, and that hesitation is its own kind of evidence. For decades after Neckham's description, pilots kept the needle as a backup rather than a primary guide, still checking the sky whenever it was visible and reaching for the compass mainly on the cloudy, moonless nights when the stars gave them nothing at all. Charts from Mediterranean pilots in the 12 and 1300s, the earliest of what are now called Portolan charts, begin appearing covered in crisscrossing room lines clearly drawn using compass bearings, a visible record of navigators slowly shifting their trust from the open sky to a needle floating in a bowl. Here is the detail worth sitting with, because it is easy to read past a small magnetized needle without feeling its actual weight. This was the piece of equipment that finally let a ship's captain choose to sail away from the coastline on purpose and trust that he could find his way back, rather than being forced to hug familiar shores out of raw necessity. Every long ocean crossing that followed, every westward gamble across open water with no land in sight for weeks at a time, depended on sailors trusting a needle more than they trusted the horizon. Roughly 3 centuries after Alexander Neckham wrote one short paragraph about English sailors and their pointing needle, a Geno's captain in Spanish service used a compass exactly like it to sail west out of sight of Europe entirely, chasing a route to Asia and finding an ocean, and then a continent, that no European sailing tradition had ever charted. A needle solved the problem of direction at sea. The next invention on this list solved a much older, much quieter problem, one that had limited how much food an entire continent could grow, and it did it with a piece of leather strapped to a horse's shoulders instead of its throat. Number 7. The horse collar. For most of the early medieval period, a farmer who hitched a horse to a heavy load was working against the animal's own body. The harness in common use, a simple strap looped around the neck and chest, had been inherited more or less unchanged from ancient practice, and it had one brutal flaw nobody had solved. Under real strain, pulling a loaded cart or a deep plow, that strap pressed directly against the horse's windpipe. The harder the animal pulled, the more it choked itself. Farmers were, in effect, capping the maximum power of one of the strongest animals they owned, because the equipment used to harness that power actively worked against it. The fix, when it finally arrived in Europe, was not a new machine. It was a reshaped piece of padded leather. The rigid horse collar rested on the animal's shoulders and chest bone instead of its throat, transferring the force of a pull to the skeleton rather than the airway. A horse wearing one could lean its full body weight into a load without gasping for breath partway through the effort. The idea did not originate in Europe. It arrived from further east, likely by way of trade and cultural contact stretching back towards Central Asia and China, where more efficient harnessing had already been worked out earlier. By the 12th century, the horse collar had spread widely enough across Western Europe to become standard equipment on working farms from England to the German lands. Paired with it came 2 smaller but equally important changes. Iron horseshoes protected hooves on Europe's wetter, rockier soil, letting horses work longer without going lame. And a heavier, wheeled plow with an iron-tipped blade replaced the lighter scratch plows suited to the dry, thin soils of the Mediterranean world, cutting deep enough to actually turn the dense, wet clay common across northern Europe instead of skating across its surface. None of these 3 innovations, on its own, would have changed much. Together, harnessed to the same animal at the same time, they rewired how much food a piece of land could produce. The horse itself mattered because of raw speed. A horse can typically work close to 50% faster than an ox pulling the same plow, covering more ground in the same working day. For most of history, that extra speed had been wasted, because the old harness meant a horse straining at a heavy plow was fighting its own collar as much as the soil. Once the new collar removed that limit, farms that switched from oxen to horses for fieldwork saw plowing seasons compress, and more land come under cultivation in the same stretch of good weather. There is a competing explanation worth acknowledging honestly, because historians do not fully agree on how much credit the collar alone deserves. Some scholars argue the wider shift from a two-field to a three-field crop rotation system, leaving less farmland fallow in any given year, played just as large a role in rising yields as the harness did, and that the two changes reinforced each other rather than either one working alone. The honest picture is almost certainly both at once. A harness that let horses pull harder married to a farming calendar that asked more of every field, arriving in the same centuries and compounding each other's effects. Here is the number that should stop you. Grain yields across northern Europe are estimated to have roughly tripled between the years 1000 and 1300, driven by this combination of horse collar, heavy plow, and horseshoe working together across an expanding countryside. Tripled. Not a modest improvement. A near total transformation of how much food the same stretch of land could support. More food meant more surviving children. More surviving children meant more hands to clear forest, drain marsh, and found new villages, which meant still more food the following generation. Historians studying medieval demography point to exactly this stretch of centuries as the engine behind Europe's population boom in the High Middle Ages, the growth that filled out the map with new towns, new parish churches, and new fields carved out of what had been forest 100 years earlier. There was a second, quieter consequence to all this, one historians only worked out by studying tax and manor records centuries later. As horses replaced oxen on more farms, villages began keeping smiths busy full-time fitting horseshoes, and specialized horse breeders emerged to supply farms that could now justify the extra cost of a faster animal. A whole small economy of harness makers, farriers, and horse traders grew up around a single reshaped piece of leather, adding trades and livelihoods to villages that a century earlier had needed none of them. Nobody remembers the name of the person who reshaped that piece of leather. No chronicle records the first farmer to strap one onto a horse and watch it pull twice the load without slowing down. It is, in almost every sense, the least glamorous invention on this entire list. A strip of padded material doing its quiet work in a field instead of a cathedral or a battlefield. And it may be the single invention most directly responsible for how many medieval people were even alive to build the cathedrals and fight the battles that filled the rest of this list. The next invention took a very different kind of quiet, industrial labor, and used it to melt rock into something Europe had never held in its hands before: liquid iron. Number 6. The blast furnace. For most of the medieval period, making iron meant fighting a furnace that could never get hot enough to finish the job. Smiths built small clay stacks called bloomeries, packed them with ore and charcoal, and pumped air through by hand or with simple foot-powered bellows. The process produced a spongy, half-melted lump called a bloom, full of trapped slag, that then had to be beaten and reheated over and over with a hammer just to squeeze out the impurities. It worked, in the sense that Europe had iron tools and iron weapons throughout the early Middle Ages. It also produced small batches, at enormous cost in labor, because no bellows a pair of human lungs or arms could operate would ever push enough air through the fire to reach the temperatures needed to fully liquefy iron ore. Sometime in the 12th or 13th century, in scattered pockets of northern Europe, someone connected a furnace to a water wheel. That single mechanical link changed everything downstream of it. A water wheel could drive a set of bellows far larger and far more relentless than any human operator, delivering a continuous, powerful blast of air into the fire hour after hour without tiring. Archaeologists have traced some of the earliest confirmed examples to sites like Lafiten in Sweden, which operated across the 1200s, and similar early furnaces uncovered in Switzerland and Germany, with hints of even earlier experiments possibly reaching back toward 1100 at a site called Nor-Ascog. None of these places produced a single famous inventor whose name survived. What survived instead is slag, ash, and the physical remains of furnaces that clearly ran far hotter than anything that came before them. The temperature difference sounds technical until you understand what it actually did to the metal. Push enough sustained heat through an iron or charge, and the iron itself starts to fully liquefy rather than just softening into a lump. Molten iron can be poured, the same way a modern foundry pours metal into a mold, taking on complex, precise shapes that a hammer and anvil could never reliably reproduce by beating a solid bloom into form. Suddenly, one furnace running around the clock could outproduce what had taken a team of smiths days of hammering to achieve by hand. There is an important distinction historians insist on here, one worth stating plainly. What these early blast furnaces produced was closer to what modern metallurgists call pig iron, brittle and full of carbon, not yet the tougher, more workable cast iron familiar from later centuries. That further refinement, using a new furnace design that let smiths remove more of the excess carbon, would not fully mature until the 15th century, in workshops around the city of Liege in what is now Belgium. The medieval blast furnace was not the finished technology. It was the necessary first leap, the proof that fire, water power, and ore could be combined into something no hand-pumped bellows could ever match, decades before anyone had the theory of chemistry to explain exactly why it worked. The economics of the breakthrough mattered as much as the metal itself. A bloomery smith working alone could turn out a bloom weighing at most a few dozen kilograms after a full day of exhausting labor. A water-driven furnace running continuously could process ore around the clock, day and night, without the constant human effort a hand bellows demanded, multiplying total iron output from a single site far beyond what any team of hand-forging smiths could match, even working in shifts. Iron, which had been a genuinely precious material for most of the early Middle Ages, carefully rationed for weapons, tools, and horseshoes, slowly became something closer to a bulk commodity, cheap enough to reshape entire industries that had never been able to afford much of it before. Here is the detail worth sitting with, because this entry gets less attention than almost anything else on this list, and it deserves far more than it gets. Every suit of plate armor, every cannon barrel, every printing press frame, and eventually every steam engine cylinder of the centuries that followed all trace their material lineage back to this quiet mechanical marriage of water wheel and furnace, worked out by anonymous ironmasters in scattered forest valleys with no university, no royal charter, and no surviving name attached to the breakthrough at all. Historians now describe this stretch of the 12 and 1300s as a genuine medieval steel revolution, a jump in metal quality and output that gets almost none of the attention paid to castles, cathedrals, or kings, despite arming and building most of them. The next invention on this list also came from a workshop most people never saw, but it was not trying to shape metal at all. It was trying to shape time itself, gear by gear, built by a man who already knew he would not live to see it finished. Number 5. The mechanical clock. In 1292, a boy was born in the small English town of Wallingford, and by early adulthood he had entered the Benedictine order at St. Albans Abbey, one of the wealthiest and most intellectually serious monasteries in England. Richard of Wallingford was not an ordinary monk. He had studied at Oxford, absorbed geometry and astronomy at a level few clergy of his era ever reached, and in 1327 he had risen to become abbot of St. Albans itself. He also, by that point, already knew he was dying. Richard had contracted leprosy, a diagnosis that in the 14th century amounted to a slow, visible, and socially isolating death sentence. Many men in his position, facing a terminal disease with a body that would only continue to fail, might have spent their remaining years in prayer and administration, tending quietly to the affairs of an abbey. Richard instead spent them designing and overseeing construction of one of the most technically ambitious machines built anywhere in medieval Europe, an astronomical clock, driven entirely by falling weights and toothed gears, with no water wheel and no sundial anywhere in its mechanism. Construction ran from roughly 1326 until his death a decade later, continuing even as his illness visibly worsened around him. What made the machine remarkable was not simply that it told time, though it did that too, with a mechanical escapement, a genuinely new kind of gear-end weight system that ticked time forward in discrete, regulated steps, instead of the slow, continuous drift of water clocks that had come before it. Richard's clock also displayed the positions of the sun, moon, and stars against the zodiac, predicted eclipses, and tracked the rise and fall of the tides at London Bridge, all driven by the same set of weights and gears turning in careful mechanical harmony. It was, in effect, a working model of the medieval heavens compressed into a tower of iron and brass, built by a man who would never live to see it fully finished, and who knew that from the moment he started designing it. Richard was not actually the first person on Earth to build something like this, though almost nobody in 14th century England would have known that. More than 2 centuries earlier, around 1094, a Chinese official and engineer named Su Song had already completed an enormous water-end mercury-powered astronomical tower in the city of Kaifeng, sometimes called the Cosmic Engine, roughly 12 meters tall, driving an armillary sphere and a rotating series of mechanical figures that announced the hours. It was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated timekeeping and astronomical machines built anywhere in the pre-modern world. And then it was gone. When the Northern Song dynasty collapsed under invasion in the early 1100s, Su Song's tower was dismantled, and the specific engineering knowledge behind it appears to have been lost within a generation, never transmitted onward to later Chinese clockmakers, let alone across the vast distance to Europe. That means 2 civilizations, separated by more than 2 centuries and thousands of miles, with no known contact or shared knowledge between them, independently solved an enormously difficult engineering problem: how to convert a steady force, whether falling water or falling weight, into a controlled, evenly measured passage of time. Neither project descended from the other. Both were essentially reinvented from nothing, twice, by people who never knew the other attempt had ever existed. Richard's own machine did not stay unique in England for long. Once the underlying escapement mechanism existed, other monasteries and cathedral towns began commissioning similar devices, and within a few decades, mechanical clocks were being installed in bell towers across England, France, and Italy, gradually replacing the sundials and water clocks that had marked the hours of monastic prayer for centuries before. A tool built to track eclipses and tides for one abbey ended up teaching an entire continent to organize its days around a fixed, mechanical measure of time, rather than the position of the sun. Here is the detail worth sitting with. Richard of Wallingford died in 1336, his body ravaged by a disease that had already begun disfiguring him years before the clock was finished, and his masterpiece stood unfinished at the time of his death, completed only afterward by monks who inherited his plans and his ambition alongside his illness. He built a machine that would tell St. Albans the exact position of the moon in the sky centuries after his own bones had turned to dust, using math and mechanics that most of Europe would not fully catch up to for another 100 years. A dying man spent his final decade building something meant to outlast him by half a millennium, and it very nearly has. Time itself, mechanized and gear-driven, would soon organize the lives of an entire continent. But none of it, the towers of gears, the clocks in every town square, would have spread the way it eventually did without something far humbler sitting underneath all of it: cheap, reliable material to write on. Number 4. Papermaking. Long before Europe learned to make its own paper, it wrote almost everything of lasting value on parchment, stretched and scraped animal skin, usually calf or sheep. Parchment was durable, and it was also brutally expensive. A single complete Bible could require the skins of an entire herd, sometimes estimated at well over 100 animals for one finished book. That cost alone kept written material scarce, locked mostly inside monasteries, royal courts, and the households of the very wealthy, copied one laborious page at a time by hand. Paper itself was not a European invention. It had been developed in China centuries earlier and slowly carried west along trade routes, reaching the Islamic world well before it reached Christian Europe. The technology entered European territory through Muslim Spain, with one of the earliest confirmed European paper mills operating at Zadova, near Valencia, sometime in the 11 or 1200s, a direct extension of paper production techniques already established across the Islamic world. From Spain, the knowledge spread slowly northward and eastward across the following century, carried by trade, migration, and the simple economic pressure of a material dramatically cheaper to produce than stretched animal skin. The city that turned paper from a curiosity into a genuine industry was Fabriano in central Italy, where papermakers over the decades that followed assembled a set of technical improvements that transformed the product completely. They mechanized the pulping process using water-powered hammers instead of hand-pounding fiber into pulp, sharply increasing output. They developed gelatin sizing, a treatment that kept the finished sheet from soaking up ink like a sponge and blurring every letter written on it, a problem that had plagued earlier, cruder paper. And they invented the watermark, pressing a wire design into the pulp mold so that a maker's mark appeared faintly in the finished sheet when held to the light, a practice that quickly became both a quality guarantee and a form of early trademark protection. Paper from Fabriano became recognized across Europe as a reliable, professional-grade product, not a cheap substitute for real writing material. From Italy, paper mills spread steadily north. One of the first confirmed mills north of the Alps opened in Nuremberg in 1390, built by a merchant named Ullmann Stromer, who had to import skilled workers from Italy because nobody locally yet knew the specific techniques involved. By the early 1400s, paper was available, if still not cheap, across most of Western and Central Europe, no longer dependent on shipments from Mediterranean workshops. The price difference between the two materials tells the real story. A single sheet of prepared parchment could cost, by some later estimates, several times what an equivalent sheet of paper eventually sold for once European mills reached full production. For any project that needed hundreds or thousands of pages, that difference was not a minor saving. It was the line between a book a wealthy cathedral could commission once in a generation, and a book an ordinary craftsman or minor merchant could realistically save up to own. Here is why this quiet industry belongs on a list of inventions that changed history, even though nobody remembers a single Fabriano papermaker's name. A little over half a century after paper mills reached Germany in meaningful numbers, a goldsmith in the city of Mainz began experimenting with a machine that could stamp the same page onto sheet after sheet of material, over and over, far faster than any scribe could copy by hand. That machine needed a constant, affordable supply of something to print on. Parchment could never have supplied it. A single press run of even a modest book on animal skin would have required slaughtering herds large enough to bankrupt most workshops before a single copy left the press. Paper could. Cheap, plentiful, mass-produced paper is the quiet, unglamorous foundation underneath the loudest, most famous invention on this entire list. And it arrived in Europe, just in time to make that next invention possible, instead of merely theoretical. Paper made the printed page affordable. The next invention on this list made the battlefield itself obsolete for anyone still relying on a castle wall or a suit of armor to survive it. Number 3. Gunpowder and the cannon. Gunpowder itself is not a medieval European invention, and it is not even primarily a weapon in its earliest form. Chinese alchemists first mixed sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter together sometime around the 9th century, apparently while experimenting with formulas for immortality rather than warfare. What they found instead was a mixture that could burn violently, and over the following centuries, Chinese engineers gradually adapted that discovery into fire lances, rockets, and early explosive devices, long before anyone in Europe had heard the word gunpowder at all. Exactly how the formula and the concept crossed the enormous distance from Chinese battlefields to European ones remains debated among historians, likely traveling in stages along Silk Road trade contacts and through Mongol military campaigns that swept across Central Asia and into Eastern Europe in the 1200s. What is far better documented is the moment gunpowder weapons show up unambiguously in the European written record. A government document from Florence, dated 1326, formally authorizes officials to procure metal cannons and iron shot for the defense of the city. The earliest clear, dated European reference to functioning cannon as actual military equipment rather than rumor or curiosity. Those first cannons were crude, sometimes described by the nickname pot de fer, meaning iron pot, for their squat, vase-like shape. They were slow to load, wildly inaccurate, and prone to killing their own crews through barrel failures nearly as often as they threatened the enemy. For decades, their main military value may have been psychological. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English forces reportedly deployed a small number of early cannons, more likely to have terrified men and horses with noise and smoke than to have inflicted serious casualties. In a battle that was decided far more by longbow volleys than by any early gun, the technology did not stay crude for long. Within a century, European gunsmiths and metalworkers, building directly on the blast furnace advances covered earlier in this list, had scaled cannon up dramatically, casting larger barrels capable of firing heavier stone and iron shot with far greater force and reliability. And that scaling had a direct, physical target, the castle wall. For centuries, a thick, tall stone wall had been essentially the final word in defense, a structure that could shrug off battering rams, siege towers, and catapults almost indefinitely if properly garrisoned and supplied. Cannon fire changed that math completely. A wall built to resist crushing or scaling turned out to be poorly suited to resisting sustained, concentrated impact, and by the 1400s, sieges that might once have dragged on for a year or more could be settled in weeks once heavy artillery arrived and started methodically knocking holes in stonework designed for an earlier kind of war. Military architecture adapted almost immediately once the threat became undeniable. Tall, thin medieval walls, ideal for archers and nearly useless against cannon fire, gave way over the following century to low, thick, angled earthen bastions, designed specifically to absorb and deflect cannon shot rather than simply stand tall against it. An entire branch of engineering, essentially the ancestor of modern military fortification design, grew directly out of the need to survive gunpowder artillery. The pace of that collapse is what actually frightened contemporaries. A fortress that had held out for months or years against battering rams and starvation sieges could now fall in a matter of days once a besieging army rolled heavy cannon into range and began methodically working a single stretch of wall. Chroniclers of the 1400s wrote about castles that had stood, untaken, for 2 or 3 centuries, reduced to rubble in an afternoon. Lords who had built their entire political power on the simple, physical fact that their walls could not be breached suddenly found that fact no longer true, and no amount of inherited prestige could put a broken wall back together before the next siege arrived. Here is the detail worth sitting with, and it belongs to a man who spent his life writing about far more than warfare. The English philosopher Francis Bacon, writing centuries later, singled out gunpowder alongside the printing press and the magnetic compass as the three inventions that had changed the whole face and state of the world more than any empire, sect, or star had ever managed. He was not exaggerating about gunpowder specifically. It ended, within a few generations, an entire military and social order that had stood for centuries. The mounted, armored knight as the decisive force on any battlefield in Europe. A knight represented years of training, a fortune in equipment, and an entire social hierarchy built to support him. A cannonball, or eventually a handheld gun in the grip of a barely trained conscript, did not care about any of that. The era of the armored aristocrat as unstoppable battlefield force ended not with a single dramatic battle, but with the slow, grinding realization, repeated at siege after siege across a full century, that stone walls and steel armor no longer meant what they used to mean. Gunpowder rewrote how wars ended. The next invention on this list, born out of the very same plagues that gunpowder-era wars often spread along with soldiers and refugees, rewrote something even larger: how an entire city chose to survive an enemy it could not see coming at all. Number 2. Quarantine. On the 27th of July, 1377, the Great Council of the Maritime Republic of Ragusa, the city known today as Dubrovnik on the Croatian coast, passed a law that had never existed anywhere in the world in quite this form before. Anyone arriving from a region known to carry plague, they decreed, would be required to wait outside the city, isolated, for a fixed period of time before being allowed to enter and mix with the general population. It was not a suggestion. It was a formal, enforceable municipal law, one of the very first pieces of legislation in recorded history built entirely around the idea that disease itself, not just enemy armies or bad omens, was a threat a government could regulate directly. The council did not reach this decision from a position of theory. Ragusa had already been struck by plague outbreaks in 1348, 1358, 1361, 1363, and 1371, a grinding, repeated pattern of loss that had killed residents and disrupted the city's trade-dependent economy again and again across 3 decades. By 1377, the city's leadership had apparently concluded that waiting for the next outbreak to arrive and simply enduring it was no longer acceptable. Something had to change before the next ship docked. The original law set the isolation period at 30 days, held either on the small island of Emarcan or in the town of Kavtat, both a safe distance from the crowded streets of Ragusa itself. Ships and travelers arriving from plague-affected regions would sit there, watched, before being cleared to enter the city proper. Within a relatively short time, city officials extended that waiting period to 40 days, a change that gave the entire practice, and eventually the English language, its name. The Italian phrase for 40 days, quaranta giorni, evolved into the word quarantine, still in use in essentially every language that inherited it, more than 6 centuries after a city council in the Adriatic first wrote the number down in municipal law. Why 40 specifically, rather than 30 or 50, or some rounder number entirely? Modern epidemiology offers a plausible, if retrospective, answer. The incubation and progression of bubonic plague, from initial infection to visible symptoms to death in fatal cases, tends to run its course in roughly the range of a few days to just over a month, with severe cases typically resolving one way or another well within 40 days. A person who showed no symptoms after 40 days of isolation was, in practical terms, extremely unlikely to still be carrying the disease undetected. Ragusa's council almost certainly did not understand incubation periods in any modern scientific sense. What they had was several decades of grim, repeated observation, and they translated that observation directly into a number that happened to land remarkably close to what modern medicine would later confirm as medically sound. It is worth being honest about what medieval Ragusa did not understand, because that honesty makes the achievement sharper rather than smaller. Nobody on that council had any concept of bacteria, of a flea as a disease vector, or of an incubation period in the modern clinical sense. They could not have explained why waiting 40 days worked. They only knew from 3 decades of repeated funerals that it did. Sound policy built on pattern recognition rather than theory is still sound policy. And in this case it happened to anticipate, by more than 500 years, a public health principle that modern epidemiologists still rely on today. Here is the detail worth sitting with, because it says something sharper about the decision than the number 40 ever could on its own. Ragusa was, first and always, a trading city. Its entire economy depended on ships arriving, goods changing hands, and merchants moving freely through its streets and its harbor. A full, indefinite lockdown, sealing the port entirely against every incoming ship, would have been economically catastrophic, potentially as damaging to the city's survival as the plague itself. The council chose something more careful instead: a fixed, predictable, publicly known waiting period, long enough to catch the disease before it entered the city, short enough that trade could keep moving on a schedule merchants could plan around. Quarantine, from its very first appearance in written law, was never designed as a total wall against the outside world. It was a calculated compromise between staying alive and staying solvent, drafted by a city that could not afford to fully choose either option on its own. There was a practical machinery behind the law too, not just a number written on parchment. Ragusa appointed officials specifically tasked with enforcing the isolation period, tracking which ships had come from which ports, and deciding who could be released early and who needed the full wait. Within a few decades, the city went further still, building a dedicated quarantine station, a lazaretto, a permanent physical structure built for exactly this purpose, rather than relying on whichever island or town happened to be available. It was, in a very real sense, the blueprint for the public health bureaucracy that port cities across the Mediterranean, and eventually the world would spend the next several centuries copying and refining. The idea proved durable in a way almost nothing else on this list can claim. Other Mediterranean port cities adopted similar laws within decades. The practice, refined and expanded, became a standard tool of public health policy across the following 6 centuries, right up through outbreaks the entire world lived through in living memory, still built around the same basic logic a small Adriatic council worked out by hand in 1377. Watch, wait, and only then let people through the gate. A city too small to survive a full lockdown accidentally invented one of the most durable public health tools humanity has ever built. The final invention on this list needed no council vote and no municipal law at all. It simply put a new kind of book into more hands than any single government could ever have controlled, and by the time anyone in power understood what that meant, it was already far too late to stop it. Yep. Number 1. The printing press. In the German city of Mainz, sometime around 1440, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg began quietly assembling a machine out of technologies that already existed separately, all across Europe, waiting for someone to combine them into a single working system. None of the individual pieces were new. The screw press itself had been used for centuries to crush olives and press wine. Movable metal type, Individual letters that could be arranged, printed, and rearranged into new words had already been experimented with in Asia. Oil-based ink, paper manufacturing, and the codex book format, pages bound along one edge rather than rolled into a scroll, all already existed as separate, mature technologies. Gutenberg's genius was not inventing any one of these things. It was recognizing that, combined correctly, they could replace the hand of a scribe entirely. The hardest technical problem turned out to be the type itself. Gutenberg needed a metal alloy that could be cast quickly and precisely into thousands of individual letter shapes, and that would hold those exact shapes crisply through thousands of repeated impressions without wearing down, warping, or smearing. He eventually settled on a mixture of lead, tin, and antimony, a formula close enough to correct that variations of it remained standard in printing type for the next 400 years. By around 1450, his workshop had a functioning press. By 1452, he had begun the project that would define his legacy completely, printing a full Latin Bible. The finished result, now known as the Gutenberg Bible, ran to roughly 1,300 pages across 2 volumes, printed with 42 lines of dense black-letter text per column. Gutenberg produced an estimated 180 copies in the initial run, the overwhelming majority on paper, with a smaller number, likely around 40, printed instead on vellum, prepared animal skin, for wealthier buyers who still wanted the prestige and durability of a traditional luxury manuscript. Scholars today can still trace roughly 50 surviving copies scattered across libraries and collections worldwide. Each one, a physical artifact of the exact moment European book production stopped being a matter of one scribe, one pen, one page at a time. That shift in production method is the entire story here, and it is almost impossible to overstate how completely it reordered who got to read, write, and think in public. Before Gutenberg, a single Bible could take a skilled scribe the better part of a year to copy by hand, meaning books existed in the hundreds or low thousands across the entire continent, concentrated almost entirely inside monastery scriptoria, cathedral libraries, and the private collections of royalty and high nobility. Knowledge moved at the speed of a hand-copied page. Gutenberg's press could turn out the equivalent of a scribe's full year of labor in a matter of days, and it could do that over and over, indefinitely, without ever tiring or silently propagating a single copying error into every future copy, the way hand transcription sometimes did. Within roughly 50 years of Gutenberg's first Bible, printing presses had spread to more than 250 cities across Europe, and historians estimate that more books were produced in that first half-century of print than had been copied by hand across the entire preceding millennium combined. The monopoly that monasteries and the church had held for centuries over who could copy, own, and therefore control access to written knowledge did not just weaken. It effectively collapsed within 2 generations, replaced by a genuinely new class of people entirely: secular printers, publishers, and booksellers operating for profit in cities with no monastery walls involved at all. That collapse reached further than religion and scholarship alone. Printed pamphlets, almanacs, and cheap instructional booklets began circulating among tradespeople, merchants, and eventually literate farmers, groups that had almost never owned a hand-copied book in their lives simply because none had ever existed at a price they could afford. Literacy itself, which had been a narrow specialty confined mostly to clergy and nobility for most of the Middle Ages, slowly became a skill worth acquiring for anyone with access to a growing supply of cheap printed material and a reason to read it. Here is the detail worth sitting with as the final word on this entire list. Within roughly 65 years of Gutenberg's press going into operation, a German monk named Martin Luther posted a document listing 95 theological objections on a church door in Wittenberg, intending it, by his own account, as an academic invitation to formal debate among scholars. Handwritten, it might have stayed exactly that, a local argument among clergy that never left the town. Printed and reproduced by the hundreds within weeks, it ignited the Protestant Reformation, split Christian Europe along religious lines for the next century, and helped trigger decades of war. Gutenberg did not intend to cause a religious schism. He was not trying to spark a scientific revolution or make literacy a realistic goal for ordinary tradespeople and their children, or make it possible for a single controversial idea to outrun any government's or church's ability to physically suppress every copy of it. He was trying to solve a mechanical problem: how to reproduce a page faster than a hand holding a pen. He solved it so completely that within 2 generations, no institution on the continent, however old, however powerful, could fully control who got to read, who got to write, or who got to argue back. 10 inventions. 10 small, often nameless breakthroughs that quietly outgrew the century that made them. A pair of ground glass lenses nobody signed. A crossbow a pope tried and failed to ban. A needle that pointed north and let sailors leave the coastline behind on purpose. A strip of leather that tripled a continent's food supply. A furnace hot enough to finally pour iron like water. A dying monk's machine that tracked the moon. A sheet of cheap paper that made ink affordable to spill. A cannon that ended the age of the armored knight. A 40-day wait that gave the world a word it still uses today. And a printing press that broke, within 2 generations, a monopoly on knowledge that had stood for 1,000 years. None of these started as history-changing. Most of them started as a solution to one small, specific, unglamorous problem: a scribe with failing eyesight, a choking horse, a furnace that could not get hot enough, a city that could not afford to lose either its trade or its people. Nobody who built any of them sat down intending to reshape a civilization. They were mostly trying to fix the one thing directly in front of them. Most people learn a fact like that and move on. You just watched 10 of them back to back and traced exactly how a small fix in one workshop, one field, one furnace, one city council chamber, ended up rewriting how an entire continent lived, fought, traded, and believed. So which one of these 10 do you think actually deserves the top spot? Argue for your pick in the comments and be specific about why it outweighs the rest. And if 10 quiet inventions changing the entire medieval world was not enough, subscribe, because history buried plenty more of them, and we intend to keep digging them back up.